Awesome, great. Thank you. And thank you, Andres, for getting us kicked off with introductions. We are now ready to start the webinar. So welcome to today's Connecting a Business Initiative webinar on gender, private sector, and disaster management. My name is Rachel Huguet. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Officer at the Hilton Foundation, which is a founding member of the CBi Executive Committee. And I'll be your moderator today for this very important and timely conversation. To kick things off, we have April Pham, the head of the gender unit at UN OCHA, who'll provide a welcome and share the structure of today's webinar. Welcome, Ms. Pham.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and apologies that I was a little bit delayed. I was trying to work out my system this morning. It was refusing to work. It's a pleasure to join you for this conversation. I think this is an area of work that has often not been taken on very seriously, and I think it's about time that we look at it. So first of all, the OCHA UNDP Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI, is a multi-stakeholder initiative that transforms the way the private sector engages before, during, and after crisis to make people and businesses more resilient. And just on this, I want to say that I'm very supportive of these partnerships, because we do want to cement that whole of society responsibility when it comes to addressing humanitarian needs, but also on the issue of advancing gender equality. So CBI has two outputs in its work towards sustainable development goals: the Sendai Framework and Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Agenda for Humanity. Firstly, it's strengthened dialogue and coordination between the private sector and other humanitarian development actors in disaster risk reduction, emergency preparedness, response and recovery, and support the ready and able country level private sector networks to anticipate and respond to emergencies. Some of the direct contributions that businesses have had on humanitarian action is through their innovation in technology, including in logistics, telecommunications, and cash transfer mechanisms, social enterprises, and partnerships to meet humanitarian needs. For example, Invenio is a non-profit social enterprise that provided internet connections to support the Ebola response in West Africa and humanitarian response in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. I also remember the time when I was working in Geneva when the IKEA and UNHCR, the IKEA Foundation together with UNHCR built a very unique and innovative partnership that has transformed the work of UNHCR with refugee populations. It had introduced new ways of working that deeply influence how organizations partner with the private sector, particularly when it comes to access to clean energy and for financial inclusion. So since 2010, IKEA Foundation has committed more than USD $200 million in cash and in kind to UNHCR's work. But I also remember the innovation between IKEA and UNHCR in design of tents and shelter construction for IDPs and refugees. And I think it's those kinds of innovations that we really appreciate. So as CBI builds a capacity for local action and takes an anticipatory approach to addressing underlying vulnerabilities, it has recognized gender as an essential factor in private sector disaster management. So hence this gender research to learn more about the work and approaches that have been conducted so far in this whole gender and private sector and disaster management space. It's become evident that we do need to ensure that this gender lens is applied to disaster management and that we all can play a role, and including the community in business, private sector partnerships with humanitarian agents. So in this webinar, the findings of the research will be presented, and we will consider why gender is important in the private sector, how gender considerations can further improve the private sector disaster management interventions, and why this is good business and a good business model for all of us. It's actually not just about advancing gender equality, but that advancing gender equality is also good for business. Although gender and the private sector and disaster management is rather a new field, there are quite significant steps made in this arena, and there's quite a number of stakeholders. So we will hear from some of the good practices of our colleagues at UN Women, GSMA, and also the CBi Private Sector Members Network, to learn more about what they're doing and to share some of the practices that they've been undertaking. So likewise, it's important to know where we are and what else do we need to do to step up some of these efforts. So the webinar is an opportunity for discussion. So at the end of the presentations and the sessions, we hope to hear from all of you and to listen to your contributions. The future of this field is not yet defined, so it does require a lot of contributions and ideas from all of us. The private sector, as I've said, has a role in advancing gender equality and contributing to the work that we all do in the development and humanitarian space. And we welcome the initiatives that you will present and the opportunity to learn more. We have to remember that, when we talk about disasters, it does have a detrimental impact on all members of the community, in particular marginalized groups. But we know that women and girls, due to the gender roles that they play, are much more burdened with responsibilities pre, post, and after disasters. So how can we support in mitigating some of the negative impacts? I encourage you all to contribute to the conversation, and of course, further to that, to also look at the COVID-19 and some of the learnings from how we've adapted services to respond to that emergency as well. And as this pandemic is creating, devastating impacts for all, and it does have an impact on gender equality, and rolling back some of the gains already made in this agenda, it's important to look at what else we can all do to partner and to collaborate and to look at how we can further this agenda together. So I look forward to this interactive session with you all, and I welcome you to this wonderful event.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ms. Pham. It really is pretty incredible, all the work that CBi has done in just 4 years. And I love your message that this is not yet a defined sector, because I think that creates a lot of opportunity for everyone on this call and the panelists to shape it and see what can be done with the private sector and gender and disaster response. So just some quick housekeeping before we dive into the content of today's presentations. I just really like to highlight that even though this is a virtual panel, we want it to be an interactive one. So please, whenever you have the opportunity, use the chat function on the right to ask questions, have a conversation, ask questions of the panelists. I'll be helping to bring those over to them. And then later on in the presentation, we'll be introducing a tool called Mentimeter, which will actually allow you to provide some real-time input and feedback that CBi can also use in its work going forward. So it's really important that we engage whenever possible. At this moment, though, we're going to move forward to the formal presentation of CBi's research. So I'd like to introduce Maria Kontro. She's a consultant who's been working with CBi for a few months on this, and she'll be presenting on the role of gender and disaster management in the private sector. Maria.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Maria Kontro, and I'm a gender research consultant at Connecting Business Initiative. So CBi has recognized gender to be an important factor in disaster management, and has therefore conducted research on the on gender and the private sector disaster management. It is mainly a mapping of existing material as well as an analysis. And within this mapping, over 180 documents were analyzed and listed, and 47 persons were interviewed to better understand where we are with gender, private sector, and disaster management, those fields combined. The research also includes case studies as well as brief case examples within chapters, within the different chapters of the research. And the case studies focus on the women-led micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in parallel disasters. The second one is about gender and displacement, and the third one about gender in data and technology in disaster management. So I will present the key points of each chapter of the research, and the full research document will also be available later. Next slide, please. So let's start first of why gender is important in disaster management and what is gender. So gender is a social and cultural construct that assigns roles and responsibilities to males and females based on their biological sex. And this can result in gender inequality. Gender inequality then increases the vulnerability to disasters, heightens the exposure to risk, and restrains the capacity to respond and recover. Disasters overall affect women, men, girls, and boys in different ways, and it is very context specific. So we need sex and age disaggregated data in order to know what is happening. So here on the left, we have UN Women graphic from 7 different disasters in which sex and age disaggregated data was available and analyzed. So we can see in blue is the female mortality in percentage compared to the male mortality in red in these 7 different disasters. So even though it is very context specific and these disasters are from Asia and the Pacific, but we can see that gender is a very important factor in disaster management. Yet at the same time, women are the most excluded from decision making in all levels, and their needs are being deprioritized in disasters. In addition to gender inequality, gender equality, and human rights, gender inclusion is therefore also a significant factor for the results of disaster management, as it helps to target the actions towards the majority of vulnerable people. Next. So, as mentioned, we need to understand gender in order to avoid a negative cycle. And with that, I mean when we have existing social inequalities and they then transform into greater vulnerability to disasters. And when a disaster strikes, then we have a downward spiral of poverty that further increases the inequalities and further the vulnerability to disasters. But we do want to consider that in disaster management, the data we have might sometimes be might sometimes have gendered bias within the data, as damages and losses in emergencies are usually recorded in productive resources and economic sectors that tend to be disproportionately represented by men. And in many contexts, there is also a gendered aspect in land ownership within families, where, for example, men owning the land in which the entire family works. And this applies often to family businesses as well, and therefore on who is receiving the humanitarian assistance. Men are also often interviewed as heads of the household in damage and needs assessments, which then raises the question of whose needs are we reporting and whose needs are we not reporting. Next. So this then translates also into the importance of gender also in private sector disaster management. Just to mention a few most important matters within the research and mapping of the materials. So women are overrepresented in hardest hit economic sectors in disasters, as well as in the informal sectors, informal sector and micro, small and medium-sized enterprises that are characterized by informality and which are the most vulnerable ones to disasters. Women are more affected by poverty and extreme poverty, and the gender wage gap is important here, and poverty being a very strong vulnerability factor to disasters. And women face multiple financial and non-financial barriers to access financing. The responsibility of unpaid work is very significant factors. In normal situations, women can spend in some communities 14 hours a day in these unpaid responsibilities, and this workload increases in disasters, and it influences women-led micro, small, medium-sized enterprise recovery and survival, as the time is prioritized or dedicated elsewhere. So as women work longer hours with paid and unpaid responsibilities, their abilities to participate in decision-making in humanitarian context becomes also limited, and therefore their needs are deprioritized. Gender-based violence increases in disasters, and this also influences women's choices, as well as the overall security concerns that restricts women's ability to work, and then the digital gender divide also limits their ability to run their business from home. But at the same time, the business sector continues to be male dominated, and many of these realities affecting women are not considered, for example, in business continuity planning. Next. And this influences not only to natural hazard scenarios, but also to fragile context and conflict affected areas. So there is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, in which 6 priority areas have been identified, including ensuring women's participation in economic decision-making in post-conflict situations. Women often contribute significantly to repair shattered economies after conflict, and the relevant considerations within this also include the conflict economy and gender-based violence. For example, as billions of dollars are spent every year to peace and security, but to whose peace and to whose security? As we also want to consider the sexual and gender-based violence and the importance of it, and the cost of it is approximately between 2 and 5% of the world GDP annually. The private sector, which provides 9 out of 10 jobs in developing countries, has not had a significant role yet. However, there is a significant potential for private sector companies to make a difference. And for example, including the existing private sector mechanisms in the Women, Peace and Security dialogues could be a key step to the right direction in this field. Next, please. And in the research, of course, there's a special chapter on gender and COVID-19, as the impact of the global COVID-19 is deeply gendered and therefore influencing the overall global gender progress, as it has already reversed decades of fragile process on gender equality. The digital gender divide here, again, is very important as it further increases the impact on women in the private sector, as women have less access to technology and internet, which are needed in a pandemic situation, and therefore it influences their businesses and management of their businesses. Women also continue to be systematically excluded from decision making, also within the pandemic context, and their needs are deprioritized in many settings. The research showed that there have been quite few materials before the pandemic that would combine all three areas. And with that, I mean combining gender, private sector, and disaster management together. There are materials which combine gender with disaster management or gender with private sector, but hardly any combining all those three areas together before the pandemic, as COVID-19 is affecting both gender and the private sector. There has been a significant increase in the documents and other materials that combine all those three areas together. Next, please. So here we connect to the window of opportunity. While crises often have devastating impacts, they can also provide an opportunity to transform traditional gender norms and inequalities, because disasters may change gender responsibilities, and these new responsibilities may stay after a disaster as well, and they can also reveal inequality structure. So Build Back Better is not only about infrastructure, it's also about the private sector and about the gender work. How can we build back better in a way in the recovery phase that we don't build back the same risk that existed before a disaster? Several important considerations as women deal with disaster consequences more directly. They would have a very important knowledge to make business more resilient, and this has been used in some settings already. And we also want to remember that women are not a minority. They represent 51% of the population and a majority of vulnerable population. They are also often responsible of the other vulnerable groups, such as children, elderly, and disabled. And gender, therefore, influences greatly the response and recovery towards the most affected people. And studies also show that gender equality is good for business, and that business can react to women's needs. And the existing programs also highlight that companies need to protect their workers, their marketplace, and their supply chains with gender lenses involving women's realities. This is a summary of the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. We'll probably say this, a dozen times today, but I don't think this conversation could have come at a more important moment, especially just hearing you talk about, the level of unpaid work that women take on. And I think COVID has really exacerbated that, along with so many of the other points that you made. I know that I'm sure our participants are really excited to ask you questions. We're going to hold some of those questions until later on in the presentation, just in the interest of time. But I believe we do have our first Mentimeter poll now. I'm not sure, Hisai, if you could put that on the screen. Perfect. So if you haven't used Mentimeter before, and I hadn't before this presentation, it is really simple. It's just an online platform where we can ask you questions and you can provide your input in real time. So all we're going to ask you to do is go to either a web browser, or you can do it on your cell phone if you're using your computer, and put in www.menti.com. It's MENTI, and then use the code 3267095. And if you can answer what kind of good practices on gender will help your work, this will really help us to tailor the remaining of the presentation to our audience members so that you get the most out of this that you can. I know if you're on the West Coast, this is at 7 a.m. So people are joining from different time zones, and I know everyone is really busy. So we want to make sure this is a good use of your time. Right, and while people fill that out, I think that we can tease up the next part of the presentation, and then we'll, oh, here's some good answers. Ensuring women are on organizations' advisory boards. Absolutely. As Maria said, when women are in decision-making positions, we know that the private sector actually is more productive and earns more. And we know that disaster response is more effective. Raise awareness and catalyze policy change. I love this. Public-private partnerships, that's my world. These are really great examples. Having a gender focal in our organization. Being in a decision maker position. I think we'll see a lot of these come through in the next presentation. So keep putting these into the Menti poll. I'll be able to see them. And then and we'll make sure to touch on them with each of our next presenters. So we're going to shift the conversation to learn some practical best practices from some amazing women panelists who are doing this work on the ground. And we're going to start with Tonni Broadber. She's the representative of the UN Women Multi-Country Office in Barbados. She's more than 15 years of experience in developing and implementing social development and gender equality programs. We're really lucky to learn from her expertise today. I know I'm excited to hear from her. And so she's going to give an overview of the women's empowerment principles and also share on some of recent experiences in the Caribbean. Thank you, Tonni.
So thank you so much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. And it's also a pleasure to see some familiar faces whom I have not seen in a very long time. So this is an exciting, and as you've continued to say, Rachel, this is a prime moment for us to have this kind of a conversation, because what we're seeing is that what we've always known, natural hazards and hazards generally exploit inequalities, and for far too long we have gender inequality as an issue across the world. It's not only in the global south, but across the entire world, which is why we're seeing the kinds of spikes in the different ways in which gender inequality manifests across the world, especially around gender-based violence. So for UN Women in the Caribbean, we've been working on a strengthening gender responsive disaster resilience program. And this program is part of a global initiative that is implemented in both the Caribbean and the Pacific and our colleagues in Geneva. And the two different outcomes for this program are to ensure that there's gender responsive prevention, preparedness and recovery systems, plans and tools. And to do this, we work a lot with the different climate change divisions or disaster risk resilience divisions. Sometimes they're merged into one in the different countries in the Caribbean, and we connect them with the gender bureaus, and we work with them to ensure that the resilience frameworks, the strategies, the policies, and budgets, most importantly, the budgets, are gender responsive. We also have been doing a lot of work to ensure that there's a strong evidence base of what the gender dimensions of risk actually are, and that they're assessed, costed, and consolidated so that that can inform the different budgets. That's the first outcome. And then the second outcome that we work on, we look at making sure that marginalized women, men, adolescent girls, and boys are prepared to withstand natural hazards so that they can build back better, more quickly. They can recover fully from when a natural hazard becomes a disaster, and they can increase their resilience. And part of this is also ensuring that they are well positioned in different industries that are not necessarily as affected by the impact of hazards as others. Because as our colleague Maria was saying, you'll find, especially in the Caribbean and across the world, a lot of women are located in the industries that are most impacted by natural hazards. Next slide, please. So we do this work through a few different programs. We have an Engender project, which we are collaborating on with UNDP. UNDP is the main lead in this project, and they work with us, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, as well as WFP, to ensure that there is a real resilient and gender responsive response to disasters and hazards in the Caribbean. And part of that program is that inequality of risk I was speaking to earlier. We've been doing this research right now. And the other part of it is very critical, and that is the knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, and belief. Because a lot of people understand the checklist, in quotation marks, about what you need to do to ensure that your work is gender responsive, but do you actually believe it is necessary? And that is something that we need to really get at, because one of the greatest barriers to the work that we're doing on gender equality is people's perceptions and beliefs about gender roles. We're also doing this work through the Human Security Trust Fund, which is supported by the government of Japan. And that is work specifically with women farmers. And this is where we start to see a lot of the work and the crossover work with women in the private sector. So we have been able to connect women farmers with a woman in Dominica who started a platform for them to be able to advertise their produce. So instead of having a glut because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in a lot of borders being closed in the region, the women farmers were connected to this woman and they were able to expand their internal market. And that's something that we've been trying to upscale through the Human Security Trust Fund project. We also have the SDG Fund, in which we work on shock and gender responsive resilient social protection with WFP, UNICEF as well. And in this, we've been trying to connect the women who have been unemployed or are at least furloughed to a certain extent as a result of the different hazards that have been happening, and ensure that the social protection products that governments provide meet their needs. And then we're also working as well on a project with migrants, Venezuelan migrants, and how can we ensure that they are empowered and able to become more economically viable as well by connecting them with the private sector. And then the win-win project, which is the one that is kind of the main foundation for us to do this work that meets at the cross-section. As Maria was saying, you often find topics that look at two things, whether it's gender and development or, gender and development or gender development and humanitarian or hazards situations, or business in the private sector and gender, or the private sector and humanitarian issues and hazard issues. But the three you don't necessarily get. And this is the project in which we have been able to take all of the different parts and pieces of all of the work that we do on natural hazards and disaster risk reduction, and bring it into the work that we do on gender equality and the private sector, and making sure the private sector is much more responsive to dealing with issues of gender inequality. So the goal of this project, which again is a joint program done with ILO, is to make sure that we promote the economic empowerment of women and acknowledge the role that women are playing as beneficiaries and partners of growth in development. And I think there was something that April put in the chat. We have to recognize that as more than half of the world's population, it's not only a question of vulnerability, but it's a question of actions of change and actors of change. And so what we've been trying to do through this program is look at where women are, not only in the micro, small, and medium enterprises, but also look at the large multinational organizations to support them in ensuring that they are better connected to the micro, small, and medium enterprises, whether it's through procurement or in terms of ensuring that they get their gender responsive or shock responsive tools from a woman-owned organization. The program is a regional program, so it is implemented in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Jamaica, and Uruguay, and we're looking to expand the program across the region. One of the things and one of the main aspects of the program is looking at networking and cooperation between women-led businesses. So for example, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, a lot of the women in the group that we are supporting in Jamaica through this program came together and tried to figure out how they could pool resources to create an emergency fund. And this is something that we supported them with and are trying to get additional support so that this could look like a more innovative financing model based on an indigenous model of financing that is a legacy of African retention. It's called a SUSU in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's called a partner in Barbados, but it's basically the same thing where you pool resources and you have an agreement about how you can finance support each other's businesses through a crisis. The other aspect is strengthening the capacities of companies and employers' organizations so that they have knowledge and good practices around gender equality and disaster resilience. So one of the things we were able to do was, especially around the COVID-19 crisis, is to try and support some of the bigger companies that had signed on to partner with us on this project about how they can ensure that their single parents, most of whom are women, were getting the support needed when they were working from home. Something that Rachel mentioned, as well as Maria, there is an imbalance in terms of the unpaid care responsibilities globally. How can that unpaid care work be balanced with the paid work that women are expected to do when we don't have the schools or the external support that many single parents in particular rely on to be able to ensure that women can contribute fully to the economy and their companies? And so this is something we were able to support the companies with as well. And the third aspect of it is the innovative financing. But what we've been trying to do is to link through the networking some of the bigger telecommunications companies with some of the smaller companies to ensure that in the case of a hurricane, in 2017, we had a very rough year with category +5 hurricanes, at least 3 hitting the region. What we try to do is then connect with the major telecommunication firms to say, would you be able to contribute and provide, for example, a pay-as-you-go chip with some money on it in the packages that are given to women and their families when they have to seek shelter, especially those who have to seek shelter that have been survivors of gender-based violence. So starting to connect across all of the 3 different dimensions to best serve women and girls. And I think the work that we've been trying to do, especially, next slide please, through the women's empowerment principles, is to make sure that we recognize that the needs and services that need to be given to a micro enterprise owner who's generally in the informal economy, or even a small and medium enterprise that is owned by a woman, the kind of support required is going to be different, and how we engage them in the disaster risk reduction work is going to be quite different than the way in which we engage some of the multilaterals. Different, but still grounded in the principles of women's empowerment and grounded in the principles of the Sendai framework. Next slide, please. So thus far, what we've been able to do directly in terms of the small, the micro, the medium enterprises, we've been able to get them involved in the procurement of PPEs going forward. So making sure that instead of hiring far and wide to procure the masks or gloves, we have been trying to procure cloth masks from women-owned enterprises in at least 8 countries. We've been giving small grants to women who have businesses in the tourism, hospitality sectors, specifically the micro entrepreneurs. And we've also been providing business, legal, and climate smart agriculture advisory services to women in the informal sector and some women who have micro and small enterprises in the formal sector so that they can upscale their businesses. They have a better understanding of what the laws are in their country, and they have a better understanding of how to export, but also how to export in a way that is environmentally friendly and does not contribute to some of the issues that we are seeing enhancing as a result of climate change. Next slide, please. The other support that we've been giving to the medium and larger enterprises are the technical advisory services, direct technical advisory services to how to integrate these policies in a tangible way into your organization's plan. We use the women's empowerment principles for this so that you can start even from the HR level to all of the different sections of your organization, ensuring that you're not only gender responsive, but you're also shock resilient. We have a program that we have just launched last week, Friday. It builds on, I think those of you in the Pacific know about the Markets for Change program that UN Women has been leading. In the Caribbean, we're having a safe and resilient cities. We just signed an MOU with the Urban Development Corporation so that we can better ensure that at least the organizations that work in public spaces, in our markets, in our parks, that they are using standardized gender impact assessment methodologies for public spaces that are integrated with, again, the disaster resilient methodologies. And we're also strengthening the capacity of the staff within the Urban Development Corporation in Jamaica to be able to implement and monitor the methodologies, because we do a lot of these kinds of fantastic strategies and plans, but if you can't monitor it, you can't implement very clearly, it just rests in someone's desk. And that's something that we really want to get away from. One of the other ways in which we have been engaging the private sector is through our colleagues at ITU and the ICT telecommunications firms that we work with, really trying to enhance digital marketing. We're seeing that this is critical to be able to not only survive this COVID-19 moment, but to build that better and to find out how can we look at what is the digital and internet penetration in the region to see where the digital divide is, to address that digital divide so that we can get the skills among vendors, not only in craft markets who are micro entrepreneurs themselves, but among a lot of women-owned businesses that are small and medium-owned in the creative and cultural industries. This is something that is very big in the Caribbean, and right now they're suffering a lot. I'm not sure if many of you have heard about the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, but it has been postponed for next year. And it is a source of income for many women-owned businesses in the creative and cultural industries. So how can we use ICT to support them to be able to manage this kind of hazard that often becomes a disaster for them? And then also we're working on the economic resilience and empowerment of women so that they can operate and in not only in public spaces, but in all spaces, in leadership, innovation, sales, farming, and caretaking roles. So that is the bulk of the work that we have been doing thus far. We have had some small successes. Sorry, I didn't tell you, next slide. We've had some small successes, but the goal at this stage is to make sure that what we do is tangible. It is something that really meets the needs of women-owned enterprises, but also the larger organizations that need to become more gender responsive in order to have a win-win for themselves, right? We know that if you are gender responsive, it means good business. That's the name of the project. It's, you know, gender equality means good business. So this is about how do we also help them to be gender responsive. And in general, any of the work that the private sector does in the Caribbean has to also be climate smart and conscious, given the industries in which most of them exist, and given our entire space. We're small island developing states. If you're not climate conscious, if you're not climate smart, you're not going to be able to be resilient and you're not going to be able to be sustainable. And so that's where we are right now. I'm open to any questions. And over back to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tonni. That was a really rich presentation. And I feel like all of our participants probably took a lot away from it. You can see the chat is just blowing up with a lot of comments and resonance. We're actually going to hold questions till the end, but I did just want to highlight that I think a lot of things that came out in the Mentimeter poll, like the importance of advocacy and having women in decision-making positions, really came through. And personally, I also appreciated that you drew attention to the fact that women have intersecting identities, right? That your status as a refugee or in the workplace impacts how you are affected by disasters. So thank you for such a thoughtful presentation. And like I said, hold your questions because we'll do a bunch of questions for all the panelists at the end. I would like to introduce Ms. Simay Kardes. She has more than a decade of experience working in the nonprofit and social development sectors, including work with youth and women. She's currently the Associate Director of Business for Goals platform in Turkey, which is a CBi network, and will speak about how gender has impacted private sector response and resiliency when facing COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Ms. Kardes.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to start my words by conveying condolences to the families which lost their beloved ones at Izmir earthquake. Izmir is the third largest city in Turkey. Just a few updates about the earthquake. Our CBi network member Turconfed released the first situation report 6 hours after the earthquake to assess the gravity of the situation. So this earthquake is considered as the local scale disaster. 17 buildings collapsed, unfortunately, and 91 casualties we have currently. That may increase. And fortunately, there is no damage in city infrastructure, critical infrastructure, or heavy industry observed. So we continue our observations regarding public response, crisis management of business associations, and known impact on businesses. So this incident reminds us once again how important it is to be well prepared to disasters and how important our role is. So by saying that, I would like to introduce you the Business for Goals platform, a CBi network member. So this is a very young organization, and the funding purpose of the platform is to build a bridge between the business community and sustainable development goals to strengthen the role of businesses in sustainable development. Our organization is funded by UNDP along with Turconfed and TÜSİAD. These are two largest voluntary basis business organizations of Turkey. And our work is focusing on 3 thematic priority areas, which are climate change and disaster resilience, future fit for SMEs, and inclusive growth. So as a part of our thematic pillar, inclusive growth, we have conducted activities regarding gender equality also during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So one of the first initiatives that we have taken is conducting a survey to assess the economic impact of COVID-19 on enterprises in Turkey. This was a quite success in order to create a tool to raise awareness on the needs of enterprises during COVID-19. And that was the first of its kind as a nationwide conducted analysis, yet it was focusing on economic aspect as mentioned. But day after day, it became more obvious that gender inequalities get deepened. Therefore, we invited UNIDO, UN Women, UNFPA, UNDP, and ILO Turkey to think collaboratively in order to add a set of questions to the following survey in order to assess the social impact of COVID-19 on women employability that took place in May. So I can share the link to that survey if you would like to have more of the reading, but you will find that there are compatible results, as Maria also stated, that our enterprises reported to have higher impact, particularly on women workers, due to increased domestic responsibilities such as childcare, care of ailing family members, hygiene and food safety. And 34% of enterprises reported that circumstances brought by COVID-19 crisis affected women more adversely than it did men. And such perceptions were more pronounced in enterprises with women managers. And as expected, particularly in the healthcare sector, women workers faced more difficult conditions. So this was actually a good start in order to showcase the gender inequalities. Yet it became more obvious that there is a need to dive into the subject. So our CBi network member, Turconfed, in cooperation with UN Women Turkey, currently is conducting a research that examines the impact of COVID-19 on women employment from a gender equality perspective that we can also share in the upcoming days. So next slide, please. Besides conducting the survey, we also invited the representative of the business sector and international organizations to discuss the more in-depth the gender issues during pandemic. So during this webinar, we focused on two subjects mainly. That was the perspective of women entrepreneurs and also gender-based violence. So let me quote a few challenges that are stated by the business representatives. So domestic violence is the burning issue, and it increased 38% in March and April. Employability of women decreased during COVID-19 due to the heavy impact of pandemic on labor-intensive and services sectors as women are more employed. Another challenge is to employ women in unregistered work and providing low income. Therefore, Business World states that they need incentives and discounts on national security costs. As other countries, the government of Turkey also released economic support packages for enterprises that have a general scope. But women entrepreneurs stresses that they need specific packages focusing on women entrepreneurs and also increasing women employability. Many of the companies that are suitable to implement the working from home modality switch their operations, yet culturally women spend more time for housework that puts more pressure on women, on employed women rather than men. So during the webinar, also some of the suggestions were discussed that business sector can put into practice. Let me quote a few of them. That's providing extra flexible working arrangements for people who have duty care is suggested, along with providing mental and psychological support to employees, financial support for child and elderly care, and awareness raising campaign on men to take more responsibilities on duty of care and housework. And also organizing paternal workshops could be done in private sector organizations, and business can develop support system for women who face domestic violence. So during this webinar, B4G created an environment for business sector to showcase their best practices. One of them was Vodafone. I would like to talk more about what they have done. So the company has developed a domestic violence procedure for its employees, and they deliver support services for whom face domestic violence, such as psychological support, financial assistance, and providing additional leave days. Also, the company developed an application, an online application, which is free of charge and can be downloadable in application markets. That is called Red Light, Kırmızı Işık in Turkish, to help women who face domestic violence. Application allows women to connect with one click to the Department of Police, domestic violence support line, and social security lines in case of emergency. So application also provides guidelines for victims of domestic violence on questions like where to apply, where to seek support, and where to go and such. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Simay. That was great. And you know what? It's amazing. I'm already seeing so many common threads between Tonni's presentation and this one, right? And I think one of those is Vodafone is a great example of a large multinational actually getting engaged in this issue. And as we saw in the chat from Andres, there is a role for men engaging in this. In fact, a really important one, because they're still, you know, half of the global population, and having their buy-in is critical.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
we cannot separate men and women, but you know, in order to support women, also we need to increase that knowledge on men, as also I quoted from some of the suggestions from that webinar that is represented by the business organizations. Men's role is quite critical. So thank you, Rachel.
No, absolutely. I could not agree more. I couldn't agree more. And so we'll do more questions again at the end of all these presentations, but I do want to introduce our final presenter, Ms. Belinda Baah, who is an international development and health economist currently working as the Insights Manager at Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation, GSMA. And she will dive deeper into the digital gender divide, something that was also touched on in Maria's presentation, and which impacts all of us, whether we're aware of it or not, quite frankly. I find this topic really fascinating, and so I'm excited to introduce Ms. Belinda Baah.
Great, thank you for the introduction. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Belinda Baah, and I'm an Insights Manager in the GSMA's Mobile for Humanitarian team, where we focus on how technology can be used to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Next slide, please. So before diving into the best practice, I wanted to touch briefly on research we conducted last year on the mobile gender gap with regards to mobile phone usage and ownership and mobile internet usage, which touches very closely with what Maria was saying in terms of understanding the baseline to be able to introduce interventions that make sense. So as part of a larger piece of work titled The Digital Lives of Refugees, we dug into the use, access and barriers of mobile services across 5 thematic areas. So gender and inclusivity, mobile financial services, digital identity, mobile-enabled utilities, and food security and climate in 3 different contexts. So in Bidi Bidi settlement in Uganda, Kaziba refugee settlement in Rwanda, and urban refugees in Jordan. We then dug deeper into what this data looked like specifically for people with disabilities and women. So the latter of which will be my focus today, of course. So in Jordan, the rates of both mobile ownership and use of internet-enabled phones are more equal between men and women. But as you can see on the slide, there were very clear gender gaps across all 3 metrics measured in both Kaziba and Bidi Bidi, with the mobile gender gap being most stark in Bidi Bidi settlement. The mobile gender gap was 5%, 13%, and 54% in Kaziba, and 23%, 47%, and 89% in Bidi Bidi for mobile phone usage and ownership and mobile internet access or usage respectively. And it should also be noted that these gaps widen as use cases become more diverse, so doing more difficult things with their phones. So if the mobile ownership gender gap was closed in Bidi Bidi alone, 15,500 more women would own a mobile phone. So these gaps show the need and importance of targeted interventions aimed at improving access and usage of mobile technology for women and other marginalized groups in humanitarian contexts to ensure that nobody is left behind when technology, and specifically in my line of work, mobile technology, is being used to deliver humanitarian assistance. Next slide, please. So from this research and other research conducted at the GSMA, we've come up with a number of recommendations aimed at helping organizations reach women in humanitarian context. And I'll go into a specific project that we've worked on that actually puts these recommendations into practice at the end of this presentation. So the first is to collect gender disaggregated data. So again, touching on what has already been said in this presentation, it will allow actors to size and monitor the mobile gender gaps where they work. Without this, humanitarians and their stakeholders will be unable to identify the problem they face or identify whether the gap is growing or shrinking. To touch on a different piece of work that we're doing at the moment that can help in this regard, the GSMA, in partnership with REACH and supported by the Emergency Telecommunications Cluster, so the ETC, has produced and will soon publish the Connectivity Needs and Uses Assessment Toolkit, bit of a tongue twister, the CONUA Toolkit, which aims to provide the tools to humanitarians and their key stakeholders to measure mobile phone access, usage, preferences, and digital skills of populations of concern in a robust and standardized manner, which will in turn enable them to assess and provide appropriate digital humanitarian interventions. The second is training. So humanitarian actors should work together to provide training around literacy and digital skills when implementing and using technology. If implemented well, this will remove some key barriers for women wanting to access mobile phones for the first time or to diversify the services that they use. In July and August 2019, the GSMA Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Programme that I work in conducted training in Rwanda, for example, with MTN mobile money agents on the humanitarian code of conduct to ensure that agents working with Rwanda's refugee population and host communities uphold protection standards. So again, the best practice example I will go into will look into how we are working to ensure both users, with an emphasis on female users, are trained to use mobile financial services for their benefit, but also to become agents to facilitate and increase the use of mobile financial services when appropriate. And finally, handset supply. So actors should work together to ensure that durable and affordable handsets are readily available, which will help women become less reliant on the handsets of others. And in situations where cost is a major problem, innovative options such as finance models should be considered to help more women become phone owners. So aside from the Mobile for Humanitarian team that I work in, there's also the Connected Women team at GSMA that is tasked with working with mobile network operators to improve access and use of mobile services for women across the globe. So though their work is not specific to the humanitarian sector, all of the recommendations they provide are also applicable to this sector. So in addition to the three recommendations that are outlined here, considerations around safety and security. So for example, services that help women feel safer online. Relevance, for example, communicate relevance of mobile technology to women's day-to-day lives so they can understand how it could benefit them, and accessibility, so ensuring that internet services, for example, are available in local languages are other recommended ways to reach women. And more information on this and my program can be found on the GSMA website. Next slide, please. So now to actually go into a particular project where we put some of these good practices into practice. So this project here was conducted in collaboration with the Hilton Foundation and MTN Uganda, which is a large mobile network operator in Uganda. The aim of the project was to address some of the challenges faced by refugees in Bidi settlements. So they did a landscaping piece to find out what these challenges were, and some of these challenges included limited awareness of available financial services and misperceptions about who can and cannot use financial services, and gendered barriers to financial inclusion, which included women having limited mobility from their homes due to heavier household workloads, which is again mentioned earlier, generally lower education levels, lack of documentation or collateral or guarantors required to qualify for many formal financial services. Women were also found to be less trusting of new and or unfamiliar financial services, and crucially, often do not believe that many financial service providers are interested in them as clients, so that they're not their target audience. So to address these challenges, Grameen developed a contextually appropriate engaging digital literacy program to increase refugees' awareness of the range of mobile financial services available to them, and the different use cases that might be useful to them, and to build their ability to access these services by carrying out mobile financial service transactions on their mobile phones, ultimately increasing the uptake of mobile financial services in the Bidi settlement. Recognizing the gender gap use in MFS, so mobile financial services, a woman-centered design approach was taken in program needs assessments and curriculum design. So Grameen's women-centered approach included engaging women, men, and youth in training needs assessments, utilizing sex disaggregated assessment data, and targeting rural women as end users of the training, and specifically engaging rural women as digital literacy change agents to ensure they would have access to and engage other rural women with the MFS training. So as again was touched earlier, and again, the need for disaggregated data, but also recognizing that women can be empowered to be part of this kind of change that is necessary. And the training itself was split into 7 different modules, including modules on the differences between traditional and digital financial services, requirements for opening a mobile money account, and action planning in terms of getting this training off the ground. Next slide, please. So some GSMA research conducted in 2015 on women's digital literacy demonstrated that women depend on a variety of different information channels to gain information on how to use mobile phones. And there are clear benefits and drawbacks of each of these sources, which is kind of highlighted here on this slide. So to take advantage of benefits and minimize drawbacks, Grameen and the partners utilized a combination of community resource persons and women's social circles as training delivery channels in order to maximize the advantages and minimize the drawbacks associated with each delivery channel, which is again what you can see on the slide. The hope was that by utilizing multiple ways to engage with those on the training program would improve the probability of active engagement of them and those that they were trying to engage. So the aim of the project was essentially to increase local residents' ability to use DFS or mobile financial services through a woman-centered approach, and hoping that there would be a threefold effect. The first is that women and other refugees within Bidi settlement would increase their uptake of mobile money services once they are aware of the full range of digital financial products available. recognize the value proposition and essentially the benefits for their lives, and then would be able to actually confidently use and troubleshoot the services that are available to them independently. Secondly, for women to be able to complete mobile financial service transactions independently without the aid of a mobile money agent or another helper, to enable women to be able to use these services more frequently, since they would be able to transact at any time that was appropriate to them through their mobile phones. And lessons from other women's financial inclusion programs indicated that poorer rural women will also be more likely to take up mobile money services once they recognize that mobile network operators and telecommunication services are interested in them as customers and value them as customers. And finally, it was expected that the training and equipping local women as digital literacy change agents would set them on the pathway to become mobile money agents in the future by empowering them to promote mobile financial services within their communities and linking them to local agent network managers, so master agents who deal with liquidity management when it comes to mobile money and other services. And there has been evidence that shows that female agents can increase clients' confidence and that many women customers prefer interacting with female agents. So the curriculum has now been validated through the training of 25 women, and the training program will be scaling up in 2021 with the hope of training 3,000 more people, and the vast majority of which will be women. I hope you found this project to be of interest, and please don't hesitate to reach out for more information on this and the other work that the GSMA is doing in this space.
Thank you so much, Belinda. And I have to say, one of my favorite things about this work is that it highlights traits that are typically seen as feminine, such as being inclusive and having a big network of people, are really the strengths that make this work effective, right? And I think that's a beautiful takeaway from the study. So we're running a little over time. I do want to give participants an opportunity to ask the panelists questions. We'll also have about 10 minutes at the end of this. So if people have specific questions now they want to put in the chat, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll let Maria come back with some next steps, and then we'll do a bigger Q&A discussion in about 5 minutes. I'll try and give you a moment. I think that there'll be some good discussion around how to influence policy, how to develop private-public partnerships and things like that. So maybe panelists just be thinking about those ideas, and we'll come back to you for a discussion in a few minutes, and I'll pass it to Maria for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. So in the way forward, in the last section of the webinar, which is the way forward, we specifically, we very much want to hear from you. And just to open the conversation, I wanted to mention a few important considerations, such as the risk, which will be more complex in the future, and the importance of Build Back Better seen through gender lenses in this regard, and to see the window of opportunity. How can we apply that with the COVID-19 situation? And as we have seen with the different presentations, data is an important factor, and to understand what is happening and why, to understand the underlying factors of risk. Next, please. So just some considerations to start with. I wanted to mention a few highlights from the CBi gender research, which focus on seeing connecting the different gender actors with private sector actors in order to have knowledge from both sides, to see women's needs and to address them in different contexts and in different disaster scenarios. And to consider knowledge building and the private sector role in advocacy, for example, in sex and age disaggregated data in disasters, and private sector can contribute to that significantly as well. It is important to connect the different dots within the fields of gender, private sector, and disaster management, all those fields together, because there is very, very good knowledge that already exists, and we need to connect all the information that already exists, as well as connecting the actors, such as I understand that, for example, in the Philippines, the private sector has a seat in humanitarian country team. So that kind of dialogue enables coordinated actions and good actions to go forward. Capacity strengthening and different materials, trainings, toolkits, this can be important. And also, I wanted to mention the recommendations that UN Women has provided within this topic. The key themes, such as support for women-owned and women-led businesses to direct this support, as well as support for women workers and support for the informal workers, as we had seen that women are overrepresented in that sector. So these are some considerations to start with. We can go to next slide. In order to continue with the Mentimeter activity. So we can at the same time continue with the Mentimeter activity, as you are familiar with the menti.com already. And here is the code to be used. And at the same time, we can receive questions through the chats or through moderated by Rachel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maria. I think so many good points that touch back to what our different panelists spoke to and the best practices. I think we'll give the Menti a few minutes to populate. But I have a question for some of the panelists. You know, I think this might be a good one for Tonni. Tonni, one thing it seems like our participants are really interested in is how to raise awareness and catalyze policy changes. And I know that this is something you spoke to in your initial presentation. I don't know if you have any, you know, a few top tips for someone listening to this presentation that you might be able to share as well. If you're still here, other panelists are welcome to take. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure. I think we have to be very clear to get allies. And I think there was a colleague, I think it was Andres, who's talking about having, you know, engaging men in this conversation as well. We have to engage allies in top decision-making positions in different private sector organizations, as well as in the parliaments across the world, right? And once you have those allies on board and the political will clearly demonstrated, that's when people start to take a lot more notice. It is sometimes helpful when you have some of the C-suite executives that are aligning persons' key performance indicators to indicators that are aligned to gender equality and climate resilience, and integrating them into persons' performances as well. And that makes managers take notice. That makes organizations start to say, we should be pulling from women's organizations. We should be making sure that we are reflecting the principles across gender equality. I mean, it's the SDGs. You know, we're incorporating the SDGs more clearly in what we do.
I love that. We're a big fan of the SDGs here at the Hilton Foundation, and we brought them home to Los Angeles, actually. So I think that's they're a great tool for kind of, because there's so many targets involved. Thank you, Tonni. And I have another question for Simay that kind of, I think, pulls on some of what we're seeing in the Mentimeter, which is, you know, you spoke about one successful partnership with Vodafone, and participants are really interested in how do you establish these public-private partnerships. And so, Simay, I don't know if you have any advice for people working on public-private partnerships, but that would be great.
Yeah, I should mention that actually we did not develop this partnership. It was the public-private partnership developed by Vodafone Foundation and also the Ministry of Family. Actually, this kind of examples should increase because, you know, these technology companies, for this case, Vodafone, has the capacity to develop such programs that are very easy to use and also very accessible. Yeah, I can say that like these practices should increase in times. So thank you for the question, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel. And also just to jump in as the GSMA and mobile network operator kind of engagement, it kind of touches on to what Tonni had just said in terms of finding allies. I think it works in the same way in the mobile network space. And there are lots of mobile network operators that are very, very happy to engage in this space. They just don't know exactly how to kind of find the opportunities. So I think if there's open communication between humanitarian organizations that are willing and wanting to work with mobile network operators, there are plenty of mobile network operators that are open to having these conversations. And as the GSMA, that's basically our job, is to kind of make that connection and enable those communications to happen.
That's really helpful. And I'm sure that some of those lessons could be applied beyond mobile networks, right? Sometimes it's just knowing what's needed. How do you initiate those conversations when you're seeking a partnership with maybe a global network or something?
I think it's one of those situations where it can be a bit chicken and egg, who contacts who first, but also once a partnership's established, it's a lot easier to continue to build on that partnership. So there's a few, I guess, gold standard mobile network operators that we always work with because we've already had partnerships with them. But then again, it's kind of feeling those conversations happening because we get the opportunity to speak to both to humanitarian organizations and mobile network operators. So if we see there's potential, then we can make that connection. But we're also, I mean, we're SCDO funded, so we're also driven by the kind of like higher objective of our donors as well. So it's kind of like a mixture of everything. We try to respond to the sector, find the kind of projects that could work with both organizations where we'll actually be able to make those connections as well.
I love it. You're kind of a matchmaker in a way, right?
Yeah.
People need and connecting them to each other. So it's such an important role, and it's really lovely. So unfortunately, we started a little late, so we're running a little late. So we don't have time for a super robust Q&A, but I encourage people to still put their questions in the chat because this conversation will continue, you know, informally and also on the CBi website. I just wanted to pull out a few highlights that I thought really resonated from this conversation. I think the number one is that women are decision makers, right? We represent 51% of the world's population, and when we're engaged, both programming and policy are more effective. And then the second one is that we need to measure and have accurate data. So I'm so glad that we have these incredible women on our panel who are really putting their minds to that and getting the right evidence of what needs to happen in this space. And then finally, one that I'm certainly going to take home, no pun intended or pun intended, is the importance of unpaid work and making sure that there's a balance in your life. And so with that, I will pass the conversation over to Karen Smith, who is the resident coordinator from CBi, and she's going to close us out with some remarks. So thank you, everyone. It's been a really important and special conversation.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And just to clarify, I'm the program coordinator for CBi. Giving a big upgrade there, but not quite yet, Rachel. I just really want to take the opportunity to thank everyone for participating today. We covered a lot of ground and we didn't have an opportunity for a really thorough discussion, but this is really just a first step you know, in the journey for CBi as we continue to develop this work stream and how to assist private sector networks in integrating gender into all their work. So we hope to continue these conversations with you. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the speakers, April from OCHA for her introductory comments, Tonni from UN Women, Simay from Business for Goals platform in Turkey, and Belinda from GSMA, and of course, Maria for all her hard work on this and developing the study. We really do hope to continue these conversations, so please put your questions in the chat. There will be further webinars as we move forward, and we hope to engage you in those. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you found it as interesting and as exciting as we do. I think this is a really new work stream that we all need to continue to work on together And we look forward to future engagement. Thank you so much. And we will be sharing the PowerPoints afterwards, just to let you know, and contact details. Over to you, Rachel. And of course, thank you to Rachel from Conrad N. Hilton, who has been our key supporter for CBi since its inception, and for getting up so early on the West Coast to do this.
It's good for me. You timed it right because it's daylight savings time. So thank you. Great. Thanks, you, Karen. Those are great final words. And I guess we do have 4 more minutes. So if panelists have a closing note that they'd like to share, otherwise we can wrap this up. And I think it was a really robust conversation, and I look forward to continuing it. So thank you, everyone.
Just to say thank you very much, and we look forward to these kinds of conversations continuing. There are great platforms. It's so good to hear about a lot of the work that's being done, and I'll be following up as well with some of the colleagues about how we can see some of this work also reflected in the Latin American Caribbean region.
I also thank you for this great initiative, because it's been amazing to hear other best practices. Thank you, Rachel, and other team members. So.
Also, just a thank you from me too.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And if you know someone who missed the conversation today, like Karen said, it'll be recorded and up on the website. And there's also a similar conversation taking place with a different set of best practices tomorrow, because there is so much to be said and to learn in this space. So I encourage you to go to the CBi website and check those out. And with that, I think I will formally close this session. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day or evening, depending where in the world you are. So